Hey everybody, it's Johnny Two-Face here, back with another reaction video. This time I'm reacting to Prussia faces the Russian Bear, the Battle of Gross Jägersdorf 1757 by House of History. Now, if you haven't seen my reactions to the other episodes in this series about Frederick the Great, I suggest you check them out before checking this one out. And excuse me, and excuse me, I really got burps tonight. And the usual disclaimer when I react to anything historical: if I don't show so much what's considered a proper reaction, it is probably obvious I don't know much about the subject at hand, and if I do know anything, I'll most likely pause the video to give my input or ask any curious questions in the comments, which will hopefully be answered in the comments below. So without further ado, the link to the original video is in the description down below. Please go and subscribe to House of History, another great history channel here on YouTube. And without mumbling on for too long, without further ado, let's get this up on screen and see how the Prussians deal with the Russians.
In the summer of 1757, things were not looking
Sorry,
good
just
for
quickly
Prussia.
do that.
Its King Frederick the Great often wondered if his participation in what would become known as the 7 Years' War had been the greatest mistake of his life.
Could have been.
After the costly victory of the Battle of Prague, Prussia suffered a decisive defeat
And Landshut
at the hands of a much larger Austrian army at Kolin. In the aftermath of Kolin, Frederick retreated to Silesia and Saxony in an attempt to hold the frontiers there. The theaters of war during this time can be roughly divided into three parts. A large French army and the Reichsarmee threatened Prussia's western flank. In July, a combined Hanoverian Hessian army under the Duke of Cumberland was defeated by General d'Estrées, opening the way to Brandenburg and Saxony. To the south, the Austrian army under Field Marshal Daun and Prince Charles of Lorraine threatened Prussia's heartland, not to mention the constant raids by irregulars against towns and villages. This was exemplified by the defeat of a Prussian army at Landshut. Though not a decisive monumental battle, it illustrated Prussia's problem. They were nearly always heavily outnumbered. But through it all, the most significant problem logistics-wise was East Prussia. The duchy was separated by over 300 miles, around 500 kilometers, of Polish territory. Moreover, because of Russia's lukewarm feelings towards the French and British and their abysmal supply line infrastructure, the conflict on Prussia's eastern frontier had not yet escalated to combat. Frankly, the Eastern Front had been dormant so far, but news of the defeat at Kolin also reached the east, and things began moving. The Russians learned of Prussia's recent defeat and sent two armies to the duchy. 18,000 soldiers under Count William Firmer laid siege to Memel. Another army numbering some 70,000 under Field Marshal Stepan Apraksin crossed the Niemen River.
I take it they would have had to go by sea, because I'm not sure about Polish and Russian relations at this time. Hopefully someone will answer that question. But it would seem more likely the Russians went by sea.
Slowly advancing towards Wehlau, the Russian army, especially its Cossacks, were notorious for its plunderings and general disobedience. The invasion was no exception. In early July, Firmer captured Memel, establishing the main supply base and departing to link up with Apraksin. The first reports of Cossack plunderings reached Frederick on July 17. He had the looming danger in the west and south to worry about, and ordered the heavily outnumbered 70-year-old Field Marshal Hans von Lewald to hold the duchy with 25,000 soldiers. The king wasn't too worried. That unruly bunch would stand no chance against the disciplined Prussians. Additionally, the Russian supply lines were stretched beyond what could reasonably maintain an army. As a result, tens of thousands of soldiers were foraging the woods and plundering villages, but marauders were not. Fact of the matter was that the Russians advanced against the Prussians. In late August, Apraksin continued his advance against Lewald, stationed at Wehlau. Lewald received no specific orders, only to face the Russian army as he saw fit. Historians mention his advanced age. and his inexperience as an autonomous commander. But given these facts, it makes it all the more surprising what happened next, because due to some rapid and unexpected maneuvering, the Prussian army surprised the Russians between the villages of Groß Jägersdorf and Norkit. On the evening of August 29, Lewald and his army arrived nearby the village of Buschdorf. They set up camp between the village and the woodlands, but not for long. That night, the Prussians prepared a march against the Russians in what would hopefully culminate in a deadly surprise attack. Lewald commanded approximately 25,000 to 27,700 soldiers, 17,000 infantry in 22 battalions, 8,200 horsemen in 50 squadrons, and 55 artillery pieces. Field Marshal Stepan Apraxin commanded at least double that. Sources differ a little bit, but it is generally assumed he commanded between 55,000 and 75,000 soldiers, at least 36,200 infantry, 18,600 cavalry, and 263 guns. The Russians camped between Uzbunsen and around the Pregal near Norkitten. Their surroundings consisted of marshes and woodlands. The Russians outnumbered the Prussians at least 2 to 1. At around 2 a.m. that day, unbeknownst to them, Lewald ordered the entire Prussian army to march in 3 columns through the woodlands towards Groß Jägersdorf. The Duke of Holstein commanded the south, Lieutenant General Schorlemer the north, and Lewald the center. Despite hoping to surprise the Russians, there is reason to assume Apraxin could have prepared for the Prussian attack with the knowledge of hindsight. His Cossack scouts had already informed him of the advancing Prussians in late August. However, because of the lack of deployed guards, the advancing Prussian army wasn't spotted, and the situation didn't put the Russians on high alert. At 4 a.m., a misty dawn, the Russian soldiers slowly awoke and began preparing for their march. The Russian cavalry and Cossacks moved from their camp at Uzbunsen down south, along the road towards Allenburg. Firmer's division was delayed, resulting in only half of the Russian cavalry moving south.
Overslept.
To the west, Lewald's army advanced. When he saw the Russian cavalry trekking south, he ordered the Duke of Holstein with 20 whole squadrons to move against the vanguard. Next, he ordered Lieutenant General Schorlemer's cavalry to move towards Weinoten in the north. If successful, the Prussians would mount a surprise attack against both the north and southern flank. Lewald maintained command of the Prussian army, covering the entire center. They deployed in front of Groß Jägersdorf and Uderballen. Thanks to the morning fog, the Russians overlooked the advancing Prussians at first. A Russian battery nearby Weinoten was the first to notice Schorlemer's advancing cavalry. They opened fire, alerting their comrades that battle was likely imminent. However, upon hearing the noise, several units collapsed in disorder as their officers frantically sought to deploy. Frankly, it already was chaos as the Prussian infantry appeared in front of the marching column. The Prussian infantry and cavalry soon fought against haphazardly formed Russian vanguards. They pressed the attack and aggressively pushed into their lines. Eyewitness accounts survive of Russian officers caught by total surprise. Some of them galloped around distractedly, shrieking out meaningless orders. Regular soldiers supposedly left the battlefield to go guard the baggage train or to hang around in nearby bushes. Because general control lacked, many infantry units could not form up in squares, a traditional defense against attacking cavalry. The Prussians made serious inroads in record time. Things were not looking good for the Russians. But to the south, Sibilski's cavalry managed to form a battle line against Holstein's advancing cavalry. Still, Holstein's dragoons launched a severe charge and burst through the enemy lines. Brutal fighting broke out. And to the north, despite the initial surprising casualties, the Russians held Schorlemer's cavalry at bay. However, this promising position for the Russians was radically altered when Firmer ordered the advanced batteries in the north to retreat. There is no satisfactory explanation for why he gave this order, but it directly freed up Schorlemer's 30 cavalry squadrons. These cavalry squadrons now flung themselves at Firmer's cavalry despite the artillery battering. Casualties mounted. To their south, the Prussian infantry continued making inroads against the Russians. Fighting slowly moved into the Norrkitten Wald, but despite the Prussian discipline and their advantage of surprise, it gradually became evident reserves plugged the holes with relative ease. This also became noticeable to the south. Holstein's dragoons lost 55 men, despite inflicting many more casualties. It put them on the back foot. The other cavalry units too lost significant numbers, sometimes up to half their strength. They battered the Russians, but their numerical disadvantage showed. Meanwhile, nearby Nordkitten, General Pyotr Rumyantsev managed to rally his infantry. Using them as reserves, they charged through the forest against the Prussian infantry. The combat slowly began moving in the opposite direction, outside the woods. The Russians returned fire perhaps a fraction of the time, but the volume of volleys still tore into the Prussian ranks. The battlefield was cluttered and chaotic thanks to artillery shelling from both sides. Eyewitness accounts mention blinding smoke. During the skirmish, a Prussian regiment accidentally fired into its ranks. Many men were lost. Then on the south, the Russian cavalry seemingly broke. They were routed, and Holstein's dragoons chased them using the momentum. Would Prussia finally break through? Well, certainly not in the way they expected. It was all a ruse. The Cossacks feigned retreat as Holstein's dragoons chased and passed Uzbunsen. Suddenly they ran into Sibilski's heavy guns. They mauled the Prussian cavalry, and as the Russian infantry closed off their only escape, they surrendered. They were captured almost to a man. This happened around 6 a.m. Fighting continued until approximately 7 a.m. The battle lines remained somewhat the same. The decisive combats occurred around the center where the Prussian infantry and Russians heavily clashed. Still, despite causing many more casualties, the holes were plugged with reserves. For example, an infantry unit broke through the Russian ranks but lost 489 men and 16 officers. Because of the lack of follow-up, the heavily battered unit had to pull back again. As more Russians began forming up and resisting the Prussians, Leyvold understood further attacks would disproportionately affect his men, so he ordered the general retreat. In total, the Prussians suffered between 5,000 and 6,000 casualties. Sources indicate 1,452 dead and 4,502 wounded, although the number of wounded soldiers seems to be inflated. Among them were 282 officers. They also lost 17 battalion guns and 11 big guns. The Russians suffered between 5,000 and 7,000 casualties, at least 1,818 dead and 2,800 wounded. Among them were 11 generals, a surprisingly high number. I think it is worth briefly reflecting on the battle and its implications. First, the Prussians managed to closely contest an army twice their size. They surprised the entire army, and initially it seemed like they would emerge victoriously. But we should also not forget that the Russians still managed to come out on top, despite a surprise attack, fundamental lack of discipline, and an absence of grilling. Sure, their numerical superiority played an essential part in the eventual victory, but still, they had no opportunity to form conventional battle lines, for example. Redman explains how the Europeans did not know much about Russian warfare at this time. Besides Sweden wars the previous century, their next best source were the Ottomans, which did not exactly provide the average European commander with much knowledge. Simply put, the Prussians had no idea what to expect, and they misjudged Russian tenacity. This is something that caught me personally somewhat by surprise, but it makes total sense. During the early and middle 18th century, there indeed must have been an absence of knowledge about the Russian warfare and army and their battle tactics. As for Gross Jägersdorf's aftermath, for the Russians, the most logical course of action would be to continue for 50 more kilometers and seize Königgrätz, the duchy's capital. This move would certainly amputate one of Prussia's safeguards, and it would open the way to its heartland. However, the opposite happened. It was a blessing for Frederick, one that is inexplicable. There would be several more of these strange, inexplicable events during the entire war. Because whether it was because of a false report of the death of the Tsarina, the complete lack of supply lines, local uprisings against the marauding Prussians, or an epidemic of smallpox among his soldiers. All that we know is that Apraxin did not follow up his victory. After the victory of Groß Jägersdorf, the Russians retreated from the duchy. Unfortunately for Apraxin, the Tsarina had not passed away. When she learned of his rather random retreat, she relieved him from command and investigated the Chancellor, supposedly supporting the retreat, for treason. As a result, the Chancellor, Alexei Bestujev-Ryumin, was exiled to his estates. The Tsarina appointed the new Russian commander, William Fermor. This new commander would give Prussia much more of a run for its money, and as the other parties of the war learned of Prussia's defeat, things began heating up in Central Europe. Thank you very much for watching this video. If there's a topic, person, battle, or event you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also really like to thank all my patrons and my channel members.
And that'll do it. This has been another interesting episode by House of History. So if you like this reaction, please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.